It was a regular Tuesday afternoon, or so I thought. I was in my office, completely absorbed in a major deal that could be worth millions. The room was quiet except for the ticking of the clock on the wall and the low hum of my computer. Everything seemed normal until my phone buzzed. At first, I ignored it. I was too deep in the numbers to be distracted. Then it buzzed again and again. Annoyed, I finally glanced at the screen. 3 missed calls, all from a number I didn't recognize. That wasn't unheard of in my line of work, so I shrugged it off and turned my focus back to the deal. But then it buzzed a 4th time. Something about it made me pick up the phone. As soon as I answered, a man's voice, fast and panicked, cut through. "You need to tell Sarah to stop messing around, or this is going to end badly." Sarah, my wife. My heart skipped a beat. "What?" I blurted out. "Who the hell is this?" There was a pause, and the man's tone shifted slightly. "Wait, this isn't Mike, is it?" "No, it's not Mike." I snapped, feeling heat rising in my chest. "Who's Mike? And why are you talking about my wife?" There was silence again, and then he muttered, "I think I've said enough," before the line went dead. I stood there for a moment, stunned, staring at my phone. My pulse raced, but not with anger or confusion. No, something sharper took over. I wasn't the type to jump to conclusions. If there was something going on with Sarah, I needed to know. I needed to be sure. I wasn't about to confront her based on one strange call. No, I would approach this situation methodically, just like I did in business. When I got home that night, the house was quiet. Sarah's car wasn't in the driveway, and that gave me time to think. I wasn't going to rush into anything. If something was going on, I needed to gather evidence. I needed to know the truth before I made a move. I headed to her office and sat at her desk. It felt strange, but this wasn't about snooping. This was about finding out what was really happening. I checked her computer. Her email didn't show anything unusual, no strange contacts, no suspicious messages. Then I opened her calendar. Every Thursday for the past few months, she blocked off time for meetings and appointments. Doctor's visits, errands, 3 hours every week. At first glance, it seemed innocent enough. But now, knowing what I knew, a pattern began to form. Always Thursday, always in the afternoon. My gut told me something wasn't right. I pulled out my phone and called her. I kept my voice casual, trying not to let on that anything was wrong. "Hey, what time are you getting home?" She sounded relaxed, completely normal. "I'm just finishing up with Claire," she said. "I'll be home in an hour or so." Claire, an old friend of hers. I hadn't heard that name in a while. Something felt off, but I kept my tone light. "Great," I said. "See you for dinner." After I hung up, I checked the location-sharing app we'd set up years ago. She wasn't anywhere near Claire's place. In fact, she wasn't even in our neighborhood. She was on the other side of town, in a place I'd never been to before. I stared at the screen, feeling a slow, cold realization settle in. I was onto something. That night, Sarah came home like nothing had happened. She walked in with her usual smile, kissed me on the cheek, and asked if I wanted to order takeout for dinner. Everything seemed perfectly normal. But now, every word she said, every smile she gave me, felt fake, like she was playing a part. I didn't show any signs that I knew. Instead, I played along. I needed more than just a hunch before I made any accusations. The next morning, I called an old friend, Jake, who worked as a private investigator. I had helped him out years ago, and he owed me a favor. Jake was discreet, the kind of guy who could dig up dirt without leaving a trace. "I need you to follow Sarah," I said when he picked up. "I don't want to jump to conclusions, but I think something's going on." Jake didn't ask for details, but he picked up on the seriousness in my voice. "No problem. I'll start next Thursday. You'll know everything by the end of the week." The next few days dragged by. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, but I kept it together. Sarah acted the same, perfectly composed, like nothing had changed. But I was watching her more closely than ever, waiting for any sign that she might slip up. Thursday came faster than I expected. Sarah left the house in the morning, dressed for another one of her mysterious appointments. She kissed me goodbye, said she was meeting Claire again, and drove off. Jake was already on her trail. I spent the day at the office, trying to focus on work, but my mind kept drifting back to Jake and what he might be finding. Then, late in the afternoon, I got a text from him. Meet me at the park near your house at 6 p.m. We need to talk. I didn't waste any time. I left the office early, my heart pounding, and drove straight to the park. Jake was already there when I arrived, leaning against his car. The look on his face told me everything I needed to know before he even opened his mouth. She's seeing someone, Jake said, handing me a manila envelope. I followed her to a hotel across town. She met a guy in the parking lot. My stomach dropped. I took the envelope and opened it. Inside were photos of Sarah. My Sarah, laughing, smiling, and walking arm in arm with another man into a hotel. I stared at the photos, my stomach twisting in knots. There was Sarah, laughing and carefree, with a man I had never seen before. It hit me harder than I expected, the undeniable proof right in my hands. But instead of exploding with anger, I felt something else, calm determination. Who is he? I asked, my voice steady, though inside I was anything but. Jake hesitated for a second before answering. His name's Brian Michaels. He's not just some random guy. He's someone you know. I frowned. Brian Michaels? Yeah, Jake said. He's a former client of yours. You worked with him years ago. The deal fell through, and he lost a lot of money. The name triggered a memory, and it hit me like a ton of bricks. Brian Michaels. I hadn't thought about him in years, but now everything made sense. This wasn't just some random affair. Brian had been waiting for the perfect moment to strike back, and he had used Sarah to do it. This is personal, I muttered under my breath. Jake nodded. Looks like it. I clenched the envelope in my hand, feeling the anger building inside me, but I held it back. Blowing up now wouldn't help. I needed to stay calm, stay focused. This wasn't just about Sarah and Brian. It was about revenge, and I wasn't going to let them win. Keep following them, I told Jake. I need to know everything. Where they go, what they do. I want the full picture before I make a move. Jake nodded. You'll have everything by next week. That night, Sarah came home like nothing had happened. She kissed me on the cheek, asked how my day was, and suggested we order takeout for dinner. She played her role perfectly, but now every word she said felt rehearsed, like she was reading from a script. I acted like I didn't know a thing. I wasn't ready to confront her yet. Not until I had all the information. Patience was key. I needed to play this smart. The next morning, while Sarah was out for one of her so-called meetings, I made a few phone calls. The first was to my lawyer. Over the last couple of years, my business had grown significantly. What Sarah didn't know was that I had been careful to protect my assets. If she thought she could take half of everything in a divorce, she was wrong. Everything was locked down tight, and she wouldn't be able to touch any of it. I wasn't about to let her, and Brian, walk away with anything I had worked for. By the end of the day, my lawyer had assured me that the business, the house, and the assets were all secure. No matter what Sarah did, she wouldn't get a dime more than I allowed. My second call was to Jake. I need you to start digging into Brian's life, I said. I want to know everything about him. His job, his finances, his daily routines. If he's planning something, I want to know. Jake didn't ask questions. Got it. I'll keep you posted. For the rest of the week, I went through the motions, acting like everything was normal. I went to work, smiled when I got home, and played my part. Sarah thought she had me fooled, but I was 2 steps ahead. By Thursday, I had Jake tailing both Sarah and Brian. I knew their routine now. The hotel meetups, the stolen moments, the carefully crafted lies. But I wasn't ready to confront either of them. Not yet. Friday night, Sarah had her usual girls' night out planned. As usual, she kissed me goodbye and left the house dressed a little too nicely for dinner with friends. But this time, I didn't just sit at home waiting for her to return. I followed her. I trailed her across town, keeping my distance as she pulled into the same hotel parking lot I had seen in Jake's photos. My heart pounded, not from anger, but from the cold, calculated anticipation of what I was about to do. Sure enough, Brian showed up minutes later. I watched them walk into the hotel together, just like before. But tonight wasn't going to be like the others. Tonight, I was ready to confront him. I waited until I saw Sarah leave. She was smiling, completely unaware of what was about to happen. Once she drove off, I parked my car and walked into the hotel, heading straight for Brian's room. The door opened after a few knocks, and there he stood. His face went pale the moment he saw me. "Evening, Brian," I said, my voice calm. "We need to talk." He swallowed hard, clearly not expecting me to show up. "Look, man, I don't want any trouble." I stepped forward, forcing him to let me inside. "Trouble? You've already made trouble. Now let's talk." Brian was visibly nervous, but I wasn't going to let him off the hook easily. I sat down in the cheap hotel chair, making myself comfortable, while he stood there, unsure of what to do. "I know what you've been doing," I said. "You thought you could sneak around with my wife and get away with it, didn't you?" He stammered, trying to explain, but I cut him off. "This wasn't just about an affair. You wanted payback for what happened years ago. You lost a deal, and now you're trying to take something else from me." Brian's face paled even more. He was cornered, and he knew it. "So here's what's going to happen," I said, leaning forward. "You're going to disappear. You're going to cut all ties with Sarah, and you're never going to contact her again. If I see you anywhere near her or me, I will ruin you. Financially, personally. You understand?" Brian nodded quickly, his voice barely above a whisper. Yeah, I understand." I stood up, walking toward the door. "Good. Because next time, it won't just be a conversation." I left him standing there, knowing he wouldn't dare cross me again. The next morning, Sarah came home as if nothing had happened. She smiled, kissed me on the cheek, and acted as though she hadn't just spent the night with Brian. But I knew everything, and the time for pretending was over. After breakfast, I waited for the right moment, watching her as she moved around the house, completely unaware that I was about to shatter her little world. Finally, I spoke, my voice calm but deliberate. "Sarah, we need to talk." She froze for a split second before turning toward me, her smile faltering. "Sure," she said, trying to sound casual. "What's up?" I leaned back in my chair, staring at her. "I know about Brian." Her eyes widened for a moment, but she quickly recovered, trying to feign ignorance. "Brian? What are you talking about?" I didn't give her a chance to play dumb. "I know everything, Sarah. The hotel, the meetings, the lies. I've known for weeks." The color drained from her face, and for a moment, she looked like she might deny it. But then she saw the look in my eyes, and she knew she was cornered. There was no way out. Tears welled up in her eyes, but I felt nothing. No sympathy, no remorse. Just cold, hard resolve. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice trembling. "It wasn't supposed to be like this. I didn't mean for it to happen." I stood up, my gaze never leaving hers. "You didn't mean for it to happen? You've been lying to me for months, sneaking around with a man who's been trying to ruin my life. You think sorry is going to fix this?" Sarah broke down, tears streaming down her face as she tried to explain. "It wasn't about him. I felt invisible with you. I made a mistake." I shook my head. "A mistake is something you do once, maybe twice. What you did was a betrayal. You made a choice. Over and over again." She cried harder, trying to beg for forgiveness, but I wasn't interested in her excuses. "You've lost everything," I said, my voice cold. "The business, the house, it's all mine. You're not getting anything." Sarah stared at me, her tears turning into shock. What do you mean?" "I protected everything," I explained. "You don't get a penny. You chose him. Now you have nothing." Sarah left the house the next morning, her face streaked with tears. She packed a small bag and mumbled something about staying with a friend for a while. But I knew this wasn't temporary. She had nowhere else to go. After she was gone, I made one final call to Jake. "It's done," I said, "but I want you to keep an eye on her. I don't trust that she's finished." Jake agreed, promising to keep tabs on her movements. I didn't expect much from her at this point, but I needed to make sure she wasn't going to pull any more surprises. After all, I had just stripped her of everything she had relied on. The next few days were quiet. The house felt empty without her, but I didn't miss the silence. In fact, it was a relief. I had spent so many months living in a world of lies and deceit that the absence of it was freeing. A week later, Jake called me with an update. She's staying with her friend Linda, he said. But it looks like things are falling apart over there too. Linda's getting tired of Sarah leaning on her, and Sarah's been trying to reach out to Brian, but he's not responding. I couldn't help but feel a sense of grim satisfaction. Sarah had put her trust in Brian, thinking he was her way out, but now he had disappeared, just like I knew he would. Anything else? I asked, curious to hear more. Jake hesitated. Yeah, I did some digging on Brian. He's gone broke. He's been dodging creditors, moving from one city to the next. Sarah doesn't know it yet, but he's not coming back. I smiled, leaning back in my chair. Good. Let her see how it feels. The weeks went by, and I moved forward with my life. Sarah's attempts to salvage something out of the wreckage had failed. Linda eventually kicked her out, tired of dealing with her problems, and Sarah was left to figure things out on her own. Brian was gone for good, and now she was stranded, with no one to turn to. It wasn't long before I received one last message from Sarah. Can we talk? I considered ignoring it, but then I thought about everything she had done, everything she had tried to take from me. This was my chance to make it clear once and for all that she had lost. We agreed to meet at the house. When she arrived, she looked worn out, far from the confident, manipulative woman she had been just weeks ago. She sat down across from me, her eyes pleading. I've made mistakes, she started, her voice trembling. I know that, but you can't leave me with nothing after everything we've been through. I stared at her, letting her words sink in. Everything we've been through? I repeated. You mean the months of lies? The affair? The betrayal? Tears filled her eyes again. I'm sorry, she whispered, but you can't just throw me out like this. I loved you. I shook my head, my voice hard. Don't try to twist this into something it's not. You didn't love me. You loved the idea of getting away with it. You loved the thrill of sneaking around, of thinking you could play me for a fool. She opened her mouth to speak, but I cut her off. It's over, Sarah. You made your choice, and now you have to live with the consequences. Her face twisted with desperation, and for a moment, I thought she might try to beg, but instead, she stood up, her voice filled with anger. You'll regret this, she hissed. I leaned back, unfazed. No, Sarah. You will. Without another word, she stormed out of the house, slamming the door behind her. And just like that, it was over. After Sarah stormed out, the house felt strangely quiet. It wasn't the kind of emptiness that weighed on you. It was the kind that felt like freedom. The silence that followed wasn't something to mourn. It was something to savor. I spent the next few days reflecting on everything that had happened. Sarah's betrayal, Brian's desperate attempt at revenge, and the way it all unraveled in the end. For months, I had been consumed by anger and suspicion, but now it felt like I had emerged from the wreckage, clear-headed and stronger than before. Jay continued to keep me updated on Sarah's situation. It wasn't good. She had burned all her bridges. Linda had cut her off, and Brian had vanished for good. Sarah was trying to rebuild her life, but without any money, without anyone to turn to, she was struggling. She was facing the full consequences of her actions. But for the first time in a long while, that wasn't my concern anymore. I had moved on. A few weeks later, I found myself sitting at a bar with some colleagues after work. It was just one of those casual Friday nights where you grab a drink, share a few laughs, and try to forget the stress of the week. For the first time in months, I felt like I could relax. No more games, no more lies. Just life as it should be. That night, I met someone new. Her name was Emma. She had a spark in her, a genuine confidence and warmth that drew me in immediately. We talked for hours, about work, about life, about everything and nothing. It was easy. No pretense, no hidden agenda, just honest conversation. At the end of the night, she asked about my past, about relationships, and I hesitated for a moment. I didn't want to dive back into the mess with Sarah, but I realized that I had nothing to hide. I just got out of a long marriage, I told her, keeping it simple. It didn't end well. Emma nodded, understanding without needing the details. Yeah, I get that. I've had my share of rough breakups too. But it sounds like you're in a good place now. I smiled, realizing she was right. Yeah, I think I am. The next few weeks were a blur of work and new beginnings. I started seeing Emma more often. She was everything Sarah wasn't. Honest, direct, and full of life. It was refreshing. And as we spent more time together, I realized that the pain of the past was fading. Sarah's betrayal didn't define me anymore. One morning, as I sat on the patio, coffee in hand, watching the sunrise, I felt a sense of peace wash over me. The weight of everything that had happened was gone. In its place was the calm certainty that I had made it through. I had survived the storm. Sarah was out of my life, and the chapter we had shared was well and truly over. The road ahead was open, full of possibilities I hadn't even considered. I didn't feel anger or bitterness anymore, just relief. The game was over, and I had walked away stronger than ever. As I took another sip of coffee, I thought about the future, about Emma, about the freedom I now had to build something new, something better. I wasn't the man I had been when all this started. I had changed, grown, and learned more about myself than I ever thought possible. And for the first time in a long time, I felt ready for whatever came next.